stand over here. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate, I know you guys are all very busy, but I am very proud to have Terry Mark, the State Records Manager, here to talk to us. And Terry comes from the state with 25 years experience managing records and information management. She's a certified records manager and also a certified public manager. As part of the responsibilities as a state records manager, she manages the records management program, which establishes all the standards, policies, and procedures for the state. She also manages all the Nevada official records. The program develops retentions and disposition requirements, operates the state's records center, and serves as the primary records management resource for state and local agencies. Terry's a frequent speaker on records and information management topics for various business, governments, and professional groups, and has actually authored articles for professional journals. In 2003, ARMA International published her book, Organize Your Office, A Small Business Survival Guide to Managing Records, which she introduced records management practices to non-records professionals. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Terry, and at the end, we'll open it up for some questions. There you go.
Thank you, Luann. It's nice to see some familiar faces here, so hopefully you don't heckle me too much. My name is Terry Mark, and I'm with the Department of Cultural Affairs in the state of Nevada. The Division of State Library and Archives is a part of the Department of Cultural Affairs. In addition, we have our 3 sister divisions, which is the Division of Museums and History, the State Historic Preservation Office, and the Arts Council. And so in our responsibilities, we are the non-artsy people of that whole department. So when people say, what's your website? And it's nevadaculture.org, and so it kind of confuses people why we have Nevada Culture on our website. So I encourage you to visit our website. When you get into nevadaculture.org, you select the State Library and Archives. Once you're at the State Library and Archives, you select records management, and for you would select the local government records management program, and so we have some resources there available to you. In addition to the special training that I'm doing today, I'm up here at least 4 times a year doing additional training, so if you know of any staff people who are missing this, may want to attend another session. We've got another session, we're going to be holding it at the Clark County government offices on Friday morning, covering this same information, only on a broader area because we have to include the state agencies as well. What we're focusing on today is just the local government aspect of it, and focusing primarily on how the city of Las Vegas is doing it. And basically what I want to do today is give you the background to the laws and regulations that are statutes and regulations that we have within the Nevada Revised Statute and the Nevada Administrative Code governing the management of records. And so this pertains to all of us working at the local level as well. So, why do we keep records? Why do we have records? You know, they say that if a transaction happened and you didn't record it, did it ever happen? So we want to make sure that all of our records are documenting and have accurate documentation of all the actions that are done by the city. So we know that records provide a business memory to your organization. We know that records will live longer than many of us will live at the state, work at the state. Some of these records have a permanent retention. So we want to make sure that those records that are necessary for long-term preservation are being retained properly. We also want to make sure that we're protecting the rights of our citizens and the rights of our government. We have to remain accountable to our citizens to demonstrate that we are keeping proper public records and that we have our books open at any time for inspection by our public. And we want to make sure that the rights of our government, that we have, we are a republic, we're based on a set of laws. And so those laws are we have to make sure that we can enforce all of the laws that we have on our books within Nevada and within the federal government as well. So that's why we keep records. And then what we have under the Nevada Revised Statute, Chapter 239, are the public records statutes. And so within public record statutes, we have the public records. There is no definition of what is a public record in our statute. It's not, we don't have a big FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, within the state of Nevada. The legislature is fairly silent on the definition of a public record. But they do enforce the fact that all public books and public records are a governmental entity. And the caveat in here, the contents of which are not otherwise declared by law to be confidential, must be open at all times during office hours for inspection by any person. So their assumption is that all records are considered open unless they're declared by law to be confidential. In the last legislative session in 2007, they did some modifications to this, and what they did was add a section in here in number 3 that says if even a portion of the record, if it has like a social security number, any kind of personal identifying information, the requirement is to just redact that information and then produce the record under public records request. There were some agencies that said, well, we've got public records, we've got confidential information in here, so we're not releasing the records at all. So they said, oh, it's your authority and responsibility to redact or separate or conceal that confidential information and still produce the record under a public records request, as long as it's not confidential. Also in that session, they added a time period where within 5 days of the receipt of the request, you have to respond back to the person who made the request. Before, there was no time period, and so there was no requirement that you had to respond back. Now they're giving you 5 days to respond to the public records request. Doesn't mean that you have to produce the records in 5 days, but you have to acknowledge the receipt of that request, and you have to identify if those records are confidential, or identify what the time period is when you can produce those records. It also says that also, there is no provisions that construe or prohibit an oral request. It doesn't mean that it has to be written request. So in that statute, it says all public books and public records of a governmental entity. But it doesn't define, that's the only definition we have of a public record. And so without that definition, we basically have to look at what is then declared by law as confidential. Now, records are declared in the Nevada Revised Statute and the Nevada Administrative Code as confidential. We also have Attorney General's opinions that they have presented to the AG's office questioning if these records are public or not. And they also, if it goes to court, then the court does what they call the balancing of interest test, and I'll go over that in a little bit. So if you're looking in the revised statutes, in the Legislative Counsel Bureau's website, under their law library, they have the Nevada Revised Statutes. You can go in there and look at the revised statutes online. If you go into the index and look under C for confidential and privileged information, it gives you a complete listing of where confidential and privileged information appears in the Nevada Revised Statutes. And then it provides you a hot link to that statute. So if you want to read up more information, what is confidential, if you know the topic that you're looking at, or if you know the regulatory agency you respond to, you can look online to see what the confidential nature of those records are. Well, they also provide the same thing under the Nevada Administrative Code. They have the index online for confidential information. So you go into the index under C, go to confidential information, and again it lists all the confidential information citations within the Nevada Administrative Code with a hot link to the citation itself. So that's a very handy tool when you're looking up confidential information. Now, the Nevada Supreme Court adopted the balancing of interest test, and basically they're looking at weighing the public policy mandating disclosure versus the public policy justifying non-disclosure. So they're saying, yes, all records should be open, and then so we have to look at if it's in the public's best interest that this information not be disclosed. And so that is done in the court system, and the courts do that balancing of interest test. Under NRS 239125, there is the statute for local governments, basically laying out the local governmental entity may establish a program for the management of records. Now, when they put this in under the state statutes for state agencies, they have a requirement. They were very passive in their requirement, not doing an unfunded mandate for establishing a records management program. However, most entities within the state of Nevada are recognizing the value of a records management program. And also within this statute, it gives the authority to the administrator of the State Library and Archives for adopting the regulations to carry out and establish the approved retention periods for local governments. So the authority for approving all the local government records retention schedules lies with the administrator of the State Library and Archives, and she delegates that out to the state records manager and to the state archives manager, who review all of our retention schedules. And so that authority is with the State Library and Archives. At the state level, we have a state records committee that reviews all of the retention schedules for agencies. At the local government level, it just lies with our agency, our division. So we know that we have to have records retention. We have to have records management, because if you can't find the record, you may as well not have it. So we want to make sure that those records are fully accessible, and you know what the lifespan, the life cycle of that record is, how long that record has to be retained, and understand how long it has to be accessible to you. So that's the value of, whoops. So what is records management? We know that records contain information about and evidence of anything that pertains to your mission of your particular department. They evidence of your functions, policies, decisions, procedures, operations, and other activities of your specific department. And records management basically manages the organizational information so that it's timely, accurate, complete, cost-effective, accessible, and usable. That's the definition of records management. And the informal definition is getting the right record to the right person at the right time at the lowest possible cost. We want to make sure that those records are accessible and that it's not an expensive system to get those records to you. So why do you keep records? Why do you all have records hanging around your office? You know, you need them to do my job. You know, every day I get records in, paperwork out. My boss said, here, file this, just in case. You know, I threw something away once, and I'll be darned if the next day they didn't come and ask for it. I'm never throwing anything away again. You need to cover your assets. You know, want to make sure that you have all that paperwork. I'm busy. See how important I am? I have all these records. I'm a very important person here, because I love my files. You know, I spent 6 months of my life creating this report. I'll be darned if I'm going to let anybody throw it away, because they're mine. Right? And then who do they really belong to? They belong to the city. They belong to the organization. Why we really keep records? We need records around to support our decisions, to identify what decisions were made, when they were made, and why they were made. So that's a documentation. Of course, we need them to perform our day-to-day job duties and tasks. That is the paperwork in and paperwork out. We also need records around to meet our legal and governmental requirements. Some regulatory agencies require a time period where they can come in and audit those records. For example, OSHA has a 5-year window where they can come in and look at all the safety reporting that you have done. So that's that 5-year sliding window. So you have to make sure that those records are accessible to any OSHA audit. And so you don't need them in your day-to-day decisions. You don't need them for any kind of day-to-day duties you may have, but you have to have those records around because the federal government says, or the state government says, you have to have those records available and accessible for a certain time period. We also want to make sure that our vital and essential information is being protected. Essential information are those records that are important and critical to the operation of your organization, and that those records are identified and protected somehow. Usually the most common way of protecting is dispersal, making sure that you have copies of those critical records located in other sites, so that if something were to happen to your physical location, say the water pipe broke over your desk, over the file room, over the your server, to make sure that those records are backed up and accessible at another location. If you were to have some kind of environmental emergency here, if something were to happen in the city, you want to make sure that your records are backed up and stored around 50 miles away at least, because usually the epicenter of any kind of environmental emergency is located within a certain area, and a 50-mile distance is usually fairly safe. And we want to make sure you know where all that essential information is. You know, where we've got instances where a main broke, or a gas leak or something like that, and people were allowed after earthquakes. You know, we have to pay attention to that up in northern Nevada, and the building is unstable, and that the fire marshal may allow you into your office for 10 minutes, and you have to grab all of your essential information. Do you know where all that essential information is if you had 10 minutes to go in and get it? We also need to make sure that we're preserving our organizational memory. There are things that have long-term historical and research value. We've got records at the state that go all the way back to the territorial days of Nevada. We want to make sure that, you know, for 150 years we've been retaining those records. We want to make sure that the records we're creating today, that our great-grandchildren will have interest in, are still around and accessible in 150 years from now. This is going to be questionable because so many of our records are born and stay electronic, and we want to make sure that those records are preserved as well, even in the electronic format. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast for you guys? I know it's after lunch, and you're in a dark room with comfortable chairs. Yeah.
What's the difference between records that support decisions and work product? As an example, emails that go towards making a decision.
At some level, for example, at the state, the records that for example, department director makes, those have permanent preservation requirements. At my level, they probably won't have a permanent preservation. It's for my information usually, but they, at their decision-making level, then those records will have a more value to the organization. And so we have, and a lot of it is identified within the retention schedule. They try to identify if it has a permanent value. And usually your typical correspondence with the typical office worker has about a 3-year lifespan. At a director, at a decision-making level, then that information will have more permanent requirements for retention. Any other questions? So problems we run into. Here you go. See, that's it right there. Paper in, paper out. Issues we run into, lack of space. We don't have any place to put all of this stuff. It doesn't matter if it's electronic or paper. It's just stacking up. Everybody says, oh yeah, terabytes are cheap. But finding it, again, is not cheap. Finding it in a C, if you're not organizing it properly, if you're not identifying it, if you're not putting it together, organizing it and storing it by some type of file plan, it doesn't get cheap anymore because it's expensive to go back and to find this. This month is Records Management Month for the country, and ARMA put out a statistic that the average worker spends 3 hours a week. I think it's 3 hours a week, just looking for information. You know, it's basically a waste of $5,000 a year, an annual waste of per employee. You know, you think about how many employees are working for the city. $5,000 a year per employee just looking for information. So we want to make sure that, because we just have too many records. You've got so much information out there. We're passing the age of information, going into, where we just have easy access to records and unexpected growth. We want to make sure that we're identifying where all those issues are. Access and retrieval. With all that growth leads to access and retrieval issues. You can't get to the record, and that's at slow search time. Difficulty in finding and accessing the records because all of the essential records are commingled in with the non-essential. Do you know what is obsolete? Are you getting rid of your obsolete records on a regular routine basis? Do you know when a record has become obsolete? It leads to untimely distributions, missed deadlines. It costs money if you can't pull all of your information together. So you want to look at those problems with access and retrieval. Also leads to file security issues. Confidential records not being adequately protected because we don't look at them as confidential records. We look at them as the paperwork in, paperwork out. And you have to stop and think, what kind of critical information do you have either on your virtual desktop or your physical desktop that when you get up and walk away and say, I'm just going to go for a minute, I'm just going to get a cup of coffee, and then 20 minutes later you're going, hey, did you watch Dancing with the Stars last night? And pretty soon you come back to your desk and you don't know who has passed by your desk in that time period. You don't know if anybody has accessed it. Did you lock down your computer when you got up and walked away, even for a few minutes? Did you put away those confidential records that may be laying around on the top of your desk that may have a personal identifying information that, the janitor, the FedEx guy could be walking by and just pick up something? I don't want to say anything bad about janitors or FedEx guys. So we're not looking at how we're adequately protecting these records. We want to make sure that the records are in, if you're responsible for retaining those records, you want to make sure that they're in a safe location. You don't want to put records that have a long-term retention requirement out in a shed that has no environmental controls in it, especially in the heat here. You're just baking those records and they will essentially turn to dust. We had one agency at the state who, when they went out to access their records in the shed, they had to take a can of wasp spray with them because the wasps were nesting in their records. Number one, you're putting the employee in jeopardy. Number two, those wasps are slowly eating and destroying those records. If you're required to retain those records, you're not keeping those records away from any kind of jeopardy. They're placed there and they're slowly being deteriorating. So we want to make sure that the records that you have to retain are being adequately protected. We want to make sure that everybody in the office has adequate procedures and training and how long they have to keep their records, what the process is for storing those records, and how long they have to keep them, and at what point can they transfer them to inactive storage. And what happened to that paperless office they were promising us? If anything, we've had a paper and information explosion. We have multiple copies. I can email each of you a copy of a document. You can print it. You can store it in your email inbox. You can store it on your hard drive. We have multiple copies of everything. Just excessive and uncontrolled volumes floating around there. And the question is, do I have the official record? Do you have the official record? Do we just keep it all forever? What is your responsibility? And it can lead to legal liabilities because if I'm, as the records manager, am destroying those records on a timely basis, you have all the convenience copies out there. In a litigation, all of those records are discoverable. They may not be available for a public records request, but they're all discoverable. And so it also, if you're retaining records that you could have destroyed and you are holding on to the official record and you do get a public records request, you have to produce those. If you had followed a retention schedule and had destroyed those records according to the schedule, you would not have had those records around to produce, and therefore you would have been saving your department money as well. So we have to make sure that we're following that retention schedule, and that all those excessive convenience copies, reading copies, whatever you want to call it out there, are not retained longer than the official record. Yes.
If an agency can prove that on an occasion you didn't follow a retention schedule, then you'll be forced to look for records you even know you don't have. Is that true?
I mean, it could be if you have not followed a records retention schedule, you don't have any documentation to show that you don't have the record. And you may be looking for a record that isn't there. Somebody had destroyed it, but you don't know because you don't have any record of it. But are you talking about in a discovery process? In a discovery process, if you don't follow a retention schedule and you do get subpoenaed for records, you have to go in there and find everything that pertains to the subpoena itself. Yes. And so even if this is what happened with Arthur Anderson, for example, in the Enron case. Arthur Anderson always had a retention schedule. They just didn't follow it. And when there was a wind of a federal investigation, they started destroying their records. And as it came closer to the time of the FBI walking in the door, instead of stopping the destruction, they just kicked it up a notch and brought in bigger shredders. And so the judge kind of, frowned on that. They want to make sure that if you have any kind of litigation, that's when you stop destruction of records. Even if you have a retention schedule and you didn't follow it, that's when you have to stop all destruction of records.
You are following it, but not.
If you're following it not consistently, then you could get yourself into trouble too, because if you're destroying these records over here because they're in my office, I've got a bunch downstairs stored in the basement. We'll get to those sometime because, out of sight, out of mind. And if the judge if you go through a discovery process and you're showing that you have some records but not others, they question, what are you trying to hide? Why did you destroy these but not these? What did they have on them that... And so you'll get called into question with that inconsistent retention. You're not following your retention schedule properly. Any other questions? So what we want to do is look at ending the information bulge, making sure that we can follow the records lifestyle. We know that records come into the organization. They're created or received in, maintained and used at some point, obviously. We just want to make sure that they don't get wedged into this storage bin, that they go in here and don't come out. We want to make sure that on a timely basis on the life cycle of the record that they are going into destruction or shredding or into archival preservation of some kind. Same thing with electronic records. Records come into the organization, are created, born digital. They're used and maintained electronically. They're stored electronically. At some point, you want to make sure that they have a destruction as well, or they go into some kind of archival preservation structure for those records. And so we're finding more and more sources for archival preservation of electronic records. And we'll be seeing that coming out in many areas of the state and looking at the preservation. For example, at the state level right now, we're partnering with the state of Washington, which has a large digital archival program in place. And they're leasing out much of their storage space to other states. And so we have an agreement with the state of Washington where they're going to store and produce up our records. And so this is a good way to start it out with very little startup money, since, as you know, the state is not doing real well financially right now. But we'll be in place once we get some funding back and can build our own digital archive. So this leads us to the records retention schedule. That is that life cycle. We want to make sure that records come into the organization, they're stored, and then eventually something happens to them. And that's through the records retention schedule. And so these are the processes that we go through to identify the retention period for a record. We know we have a review and analysis if we define the record series and identify the value. When we're reviewing analysis of the records, these are the types of things that we look at, which are important to us on how that record is retained. What is the record used for? What information or documents are included in this record? Obviously, a record is not just one document. It's a series of different types of documents make up that record. How it is used, what kind of volume are we talking about? Are we talking about a file drawer full, a terabyte full? What are we looking at? How and where the records are kept, and how long the office references that record. We don't say, how long do you need that record? Oh, I need it, it's mine. No, what do you need for referencing the record? Typically, I look at it for this year and I go 1 year back. Usually, 3 years is about the longest time that most office workers work with their reference records. But it depends, again, on the type of record. So this is the analysis part of it. And then we start collecting it into a record. And this is what we call a record series. And it's a collection of documents used and filed together as a unit. And so, for example, this is an RFP type document. So you're going to have bid documents, you'll have award notices, contracts, amendments, correspondence will be in there. Other types of records will be in there. So what we try to do is describe the different types of records that are found within this particular record. And then we identify what kind of value that record has. Records are considered to have value for as long as they're useful or needed. So that's why we look at what your reference requirement is, and then we start looking at other values that that record may have. When the information is valuable, we place it in a format that we hope will last until the value diminishes. If you have a 3-year value on a record, you can probably keep it in almost any kind of format. If you have a 35-year retention on that record, you want to make sure that you're not storing it on today's equivalent of the 8-track tape. Because in 30 years, you're not going to have anything to read it on. So we want to make sure that records with a 30-year retention are not being stored on a DVD, for example. And even though the vendor will say, this DVD will last 100 years, yes, it'll make a lovely coaster. But will I have the technology, the software, and the hardware to read it with? Probably not. So you want to make sure. Because I had one agency call me, IT guy call me, and he says, we've got these records that have a 35-year retention period, and we're storing everything on a CD. And well, you have to just be prepared to migrate all that data forward. And so it may not be the smartest thing, especially if you're an agency with not very much money. So, because we find ourselves paying for the storage of records we no longer use and are too cautious to destroy. We don't know what the value of those records are. And so again, we know that we face those issues of space limitations, cost of storage, and potential liability issues. And so we want to make sure that those records that we need access to are accessible and being retained. So we look at the value of the records. We have 4 different values that we apply to the records: operational value, legal value, fiscal value, and historical value. Operational value are those records that you need in your day-to-day business. That's that reference value. I need these records because I look at them from, this current fiscal year is really important to me. And so that's that operational value. Most of the records that we simply have an operational value and how long you need them for your day-to-day business operations. Second kind of value is a fiscal value, and this pertains to any kind of fiscal functions that these records pertain to. The retention is usually determined by an audit. When an audit is completed, usually it's a time period following an audit of the record. Then we have our legal value. These are documents, document and protect the rights and interests of an individual or organization. That's your contracts, your legal agreements, and any other kind of agreements or legal documents that you may have. We also need to make sure that we have those records that are available in the litigation. That's what he was talking about, that those records that either will defend and protect you in a litigation. So that's why we have to stop the destruction of records if we're faced with any kind of litigation. To demonstrate any compliance with laws and regulations. That's an example of the OSHA regulation, where they said the federal requirement for retention of those records is 5 years. And so we want to make sure that we're complying with that law and maintaining those records for 5 years. And other legal needs that you may have for retention of records. And then we have historical value. Those are the records that we have because of their age or rarity. They may document some significant information about persons, place, events in your organization. That's those historic photographs that you may have, some historic documents that you may have, such as the founding charter of the city. Those are historic documents that you want to protect and preserve. Records that contain authentic evidence of your organization's functions, policies, decisions, procedures, basically anything that pertains to that critical mission of your organization that documents especially all of those policies and procedures that you have implemented. Those will have historic research value as well. Anything that shows the origin of your organization, the administrative development, and its organization structure. For example, at the State Archives, we have a document on file that was from the turn of the last century that was a request from the governor of New York that we had sent out, that we were collecting signatures of governors to make sure that we had a signature on file for extradition purposes, etc. And so we retained the record that came from the state of New York because that individual governor at that time went on to become President of the United States, which is Theodore Roosevelt, and to have an authentic original signature from the president has significant value to it, just intrinsic value. So if you're going into research what we have, this is our State Library and Archives main page. That you get to that from the nevadaculture.org/NSLA. And then from there on the left-hand side, you have the frame for all the different programs within the State Library and Archives, and you would select Records Management. Once you're in Records Management, you would select Local Government Records. And within Local Government Records, we do have guidelines for the city and counties in the state of Nevada for developing a records management program. You have a plus in the city of Las Vegas in that you have a very well-developed records management program. And so you have resources in-house that you can turn to, and you don't have to worry about what the state says unless you want to go in and look at the state's records retention schedules to see what it says. However, you have a fairly well-defined records management program here that gives you heads up on and other municipalities throughout the city or the state, so that's a plus side for you. Our local government records analyst is Jerry Lindsay, and he's accessible for anybody for answering questions as well. So we have our local government records management program manual. Up until about 3 years ago, all of our local government retention schedules were in the Nevada Administrative Code, and they had not been updated in over 10 years. And what we wanted to do was take those out of the administrative code because that's very cumbersome to try to update and it's fairly expensive. So we gave the authority in the administrative code in our regulations that we wrote to the Nevada Local Government Records Management Program Manual. And within that, under the authority of the state state librarian, the administrator of the State Library and Archives, who has the authority to approve all of the local government retention schedules, we have placed those schedules in this manual. All the schedules that are in this manual are approved schedules. They don't have, if you pull something out of this manual, you don't have to have a secondary approval on it. So this is really helpful in working with your records manager to make sure that you don't have to have a secondary approval on that retention schedule because they're already approved schedules. So what we've done is created the general schedule, and there are general schedules common throughout all of local governments. And so it doesn't matter if you're Mineral County, Clark County, City of Las Vegas, or City of Fallon. You all have to, they all, across the board, retention schedules for everybody. So what we have is a description of the record. So for example, we've got continuing education files. It gives you a description of the record. It gives our minimum retention period. Now, so everything in here is a minimum retention period. It gives you the length of time you have to retain that record. Doesn't mean that you can't lengthen that retention period. You cannot shorten it, however. So this is the minimum retention period. We try to encourage you to follow the minimum retention period. You can choose to lengthen that period. However, it is at a cost to your entity. We want to make sure that you have a good, valid reason for retaining those records longer than the minimum retention requirement, because it comes at a cost to the government. So it gives you the legal citations that the decision was based on for the retention period. If there is a legal citation pertaining to it. It also identifies under the legal note if there is any confidential information or personal identifying information that you have to be aware of and think about, because if there is, you have to make sure that it's destroyed appropriately. And any kind of notes about it. For example, this one is issues with your records management program. Here, this one is boards, commissions, councils, and standing committee records. Anything that pertains to an open meeting law. If you have a meeting that has to be noticed and meets the requirements of the open meeting law, then the records that are produced from that meeting must be retained permanently. That is a permanent record because that gives that documentation of evidence of what was conducted by that committee, council, commission, etc. So what the statute says is you have to retain those records at least for 5 years on site for access by the public. And then after 5 years you can store it. It still has to be accessible. You can store it in for archival preservation. At the state, we have the state archives. The local level, we basically leave it up to you for finding archival preservation techniques. Here's an example of a record that was updated last year, so it has an amendment for August 28, 2008. And these are the recording documents, and these are also permanent, and so just identifying how records are updated. It gives you an LRDA number. That's the Local Government Records Disposition Authorization. And so that's what you use for the citation to identify your records retention period. Now, the city has their own retention period and life cycle management of the records, and I'll go over some of that again, too. For the records retention schedule, you want to make sure that you're not cherry-picking records. That's what he was talking about when he said, well, I have a retention schedule, but I'm not consistently following it. I'm just, I'm picking out records. I want to destroy the records that are in the office because they're easy to get to. Because that's when they start looking at what are you trying to hide? Why are you not destroying those records? So what we want to do is establish standard routines. That's that periodic, systematic control of those records. So at the end of every calendar year, the end of every fiscal year, you want to make sure that you're retaining those records, that you can destroy them on a timely basis. And you should have some procedures in place to go back and periodically audit departments. It may be that the records management program will have the authority to go in and audit and make sure that you are indeed following your retention schedule as written. So what you do is a review of your retention schedule. You want to take a look at your retention schedule to make sure that it's still meeting the needs of your operations. Has anything changed since that schedule was written? Sometimes you have new procedures, new policies, new processes in place that require the creation of additional different types of records that may not have been identified in the retention schedule. So you want to make sure that those records are also captured in the schedule and are scheduled as well. So this is an RDA number that pertains to the state. So that's our records disposition authorization. But you want to review those schedules at least every 5 years to make sure that those, number one, those records are still in existence. Number two, to make sure there hasn't been any changes in the process or changes in what records that you are capturing. At noon today, I was meeting with a local records management chapter meeting, and we were talking about the current legislative session that's going on right now in Carson City, and the statutes and the laws and regulations that they're going to be putting into place and the effect that it has on records. So after every legislative session, you have to look at the regulatory agency that you work with to make sure that laws have not changed on your record keeping, and this pertains also to the federal government and to the state regulatory areas that you respond to. And all those extra convenience copies, you want to make sure that you're destroying those extra copies in accordance with the schedule, and that you're not keeping any records around longer than the official record, because those are the records that are susceptible to discovery. You know, Ford Motor Corporation had nothing about the rear impact of a Pinto in actual writing, but there was a little note in the margin that says, "This may explode upon impact." And that's what got them. That was the discovery, you know, in the discovery process, they found that little note, and that's what helped the lawsuit against Ford Motor Company all those years ago. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining only those copies that are current and necessary, that you're not keeping around drafts, unnecessary duplicates, unnecessary older versions of a record, that you're destroying those records in accordance with the retention schedule as well.
In this day and age of information sharing, people forwarding emails to 700 other people, how do you ever know you've gotten rid of the record?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that we're having a really hard time getting our arms wrapped around now. And especially, you know, we're moving into that, as everybody's calling it, the Web 2.0, where we've got records now stored up there in the cloud, as they call it, and people are moving things off into places that you have no control over so that they can work on it while they're at home or on the road or something like that. And it's a real issue, and that sets up some kind of controls that you have to establish internally on how those records are stored and maintained. I think that's why a lot of larger corporations are turning to the electronic document management systems and depending on that, because when things are stored there, they're not keeping the multiple versions. It's only one version that everybody can access. So you don't have a lot of files on somebody's hard drive and all their network drives. All the official records are stored. And it's a process of training, too, making sure that everybody is aware of what they have, and making sure that at the department level that the managers are also encouraging the application of records management principles. You know, it's a top-down decision that it has to come from. It doesn't start at the clerical level. It has to come from the top and saying, this is what you will be doing. And if you have not implemented any kind of records management program, if you really have no idea how long you have to keep your records, the general rule of thumb is 30% of the records you probably have are inactive and can be stored in your inactive record center. And 30% of them are quite possibly obsolete and have no use at all in the organization that you can destroy, leaving about 40% of them as your active records. You just don't want to become this lady sitting here with all these papers falling in on top of her. And there are days when I do feel like that too. So this is our inactive record center. I know the city has their own inactive record center as well. So what you want to do is identify that operational value of those records. And so every record has a lifespan where you need it in your office. So that identifies that active file. And then you want to have that cutoff date when the file becomes inactive and when you can store it off-site. Those records that, for example, on a contract, you know that contract has to be around in your active file as long as that contract is in place. Once that contract is terminated, there's a time period where you still have to retain the information, depending on what type of contract it is. It could be 3 years or 6 years. So you want to, you don't have any active value for that, reference value for that, so you can store it in your inactive record center until the disposition of that record has been met. And so when the file becomes inactive, you want to make sure that it is physically removed from the active file. So that's why it's really important that you pay attention to what the cutoff dates or the file breaks are for those. So if you look at your retention schedule, it says 3 calendar years from the calendar year to which it pertains. So you know that the cutoff is a calendar year. So you cut it off at the end of 2009, December. You keep all of your records that were created. It doesn't matter if it was January 1st, 2009, December 31st, 2009. Those are all stored and filed together as a unit. And then 3 calendar years from that, you can keep it for 2009, 10, 11, 12. And so in January 1st of 2013, you can destroy all of those records. So you have to follow. That's why it's really important to know what that cutoff date for the retention schedule is, because then you can start storing your records that way. So if it has a fiscal year cutoff, then you want to store a fiscal year together. If it has a calendar year cutoff, you want to store it as a calendar year together. Contracts are cut off when the contract is terminated. We have some type of investigation or case files. Usually there's no clean break on when that investigation ends, but at some point there's a determination where the continued action is no longer justified. So at that point you want to say this has been closed, and so you want to close that file and then look at the retention period and identify what the retention is after close of that file, and then you can put a year on it and saying this was closed in 2009, and I know that I have a 5-year retention period from that, and so you can identify what records have been closed. So you want to have them separate and apart from those records that are still ongoing. Case files, if you're working with particular clients on cases, and at some point the individual group may fail to reinstate or suspend it or otherwise disqualify from the services, that's when that is basically closed as well. So there's at some point, and this is the event date that triggers the retention on it. Personnel files are cut off by termination date, or as we like to say, separation from employment. So much friendlier. So then you've got that time period. You know when you have to destroy those records. You've set up a filing system that is retention friendly. Then it comes time to destroy the records. No, they're mine. You can't destroy them. But there is something that will stop the destruction of records, and that's the disposition hold. If those records have any pending or imminent audit, investigation, or litigation, that's when you stop the destruction of those records. And you can single out those records that don't pertain to that particular audit or investigation or litigation, and then commence the destruction of those records. But as long as there is something stopping the destruction of those records, you still have to hold on to them and basically, as they call them, freeze those records. There also is on the books making sure that we don't have any fraud committed in our governmental offices. It states a public officer employed guilty of destroying public records without lawful authority may be imprisoned for up to 5 years and levy a fine up to $10,000. Basically, it's a Class C felony. We want to make sure that we're protecting those. We know that there is some accidental destruction of records. Things happen. Life happens. But if there is a purposeful destruction of records to make sure that you're hiding something or committing some kind of fraud, that's a Class C felony. So we want to make sure that we're purposely protecting those records from any kind of fraudulent activity. This is at the state level, it's a Class C felony. At the corporate level, as an outcome from WorldCom and Enron, they have what is called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which came from the SEC, and it's control over the audit requirements of the corporate records and communications with the potential shareholders. And so they have a retention period of 7 years that those records have to be retained. Basically, it's so that they're not setting up 2 levels of books so that, we had Bernie Evers up there saying, I had no idea what my fiscal officers were doing. I had no idea that they were doing, all this fraudulent behavior. And so what the Sarbanes-Oxley says is the buck stops with the CEO, CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, and the Chief Executive Officer has responsibility for signing off on all those audits, and what he has under fraudulent destruction of records is a 20 years in prison and $20 million fine. So I had somebody from internal audit in one of my classes, and I said, so if you're going to commit fraud, do it at the state. I think his eyeballs kind of rolled back into his head, and I said, it's just a joke. No, not really. It's just a joke. So what we have to look at is the destruction of records, and so you want to pay attention to if there are any confidential information in that record, in those records. You want to make sure that they're properly destroyed. So under local governments, we do have under the Nevada Administrative Code requirements for local governments on the destruction of confidential records. We want to make sure that if they're paper records, they're shredded in a manner that ensures the information cannot be reconstructed. We do allow burning. I know you don't allow burning in Clark County, but they can burn out in Elko County, and they do. That's because they don't get shredder trucks to come out there. And then we have a caveat in there for required by laws and regulations, established standards and policies by the state or federal government. So, for example, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, has a requirement. They don't state how to destroy those records. They just say they have to be destroyed in such a manner that they can't be reconstructed. And they also state that it has to be a witness destruction. So that's a more stringent destruction than what we require. So if you're destroying records that pertain to HIPAA, they have to have a witness destruction. And so we require you to follow the federal law in that instance. Electronic records, we just also want to make sure that those records are destroyed in such a manner that they cannot be reconstructed. It's essentially important. It's important that when you are decommissioning equipment, that those records are scrubbed off of the equipment if you are going to be sending it off to resale, and making sure, because how many times have you picked up a newspaper and somebody says, "Oh yeah, I went out and bought this state computer, and boy, look at all the stuff I found on it." You don't want that to happen on your watch. You want to make sure that you are protecting those records, and that, just hitting the delete key often does not make those records go away. So you want to make sure that you're working with your IT security team who will help you with the destruction of those records. And it also states that all copies of a record must be destroyed at the same time without regard to the type of media used for the physical storage of such record. Meaning if you have it in both electronic and paper format, you want to make sure that all of those records are destroyed at the same time, that you're not keeping anything longer than necessary. And if you do not have any confidential restricted information in those records, they can just be tossed or tossed in the recycle. So there is no requirement on the destruction of those records. You're not getting a video today. Sorry about that. So email. Everybody wants to know, what do I do with all this email? Do you have an email archiving system in the city? Not yet? Yeah, everybody's talking about that. I was over Washoe County and meeting with the DA's office, and they're going to be looking at implementing an email archiving system. And I gave him this little training program as well. And so that's what everybody is looking at. We look at, from a records manager's point of view, we look at the email system as a communication system, not as the record-keeping system. Now, implementation of an archiving system, then you're looking at it as a record-keeping system because you're storing the records there for a particular purpose. But when we look at the record, we want to make sure that the record is complete, that if you are getting official business in an email, you want to make sure that that communication is stored with the rest of the records that pertain to that particular topic, so that you have a complete picture of what's happening, so that you don't have multiple places you have to go to find that information. Specific challenges we're facing with email. We know that we have unsecured email accounts sending and receiving sensitive information. I think that happened with Governor Palin out of Alaska, who had a Yahoo account that she was conducting government business on. And of course, it got hacked into. So you want to, you'll have the IT people will have restrictions. If you're going to be doing government business, do it on your government issued computer. And doing it with your government issued email system too. Thinking that an erased email is gone forever. There's a lot of ways that they can recover that information, not recognizing a phishing attack. More and more people are getting more and more savvy on this. This is getting to be kind of old. People are going, oh yeah, Citibank wants all my personal information. I don't think so. Failing to encrypt important emails. Now this is a statute that's, or legislation that's in front of the legislature right now, where the legislation that was passed 2 years ago said that a governmental, or a business transmitting data with personal information on it has to be encrypted. And so everybody said, oh, well, we're government, we're exempt from that. So what they're doing is changing this law that says any data collectors, and we're all data collectors, has to encrypt all of their information when it goes into a portable device, anything that leaves the home environment of that data. So it doesn't matter if it's going out on a flash drive, a CD, a laptop, whatever, it all has to be encrypted according to that statute. Forgetting the telephone option. So many people get caught up in creating that record, creating that paper trail, electronic paper trail of a conversation. And sometimes a record shouldn't be created. So you have to think about, this is the Deputy Attorney General that I work with. I will send him an email. Usually what I'll get back, if it's a response, I'll get one word back, yes or no, or he will call me back, because he won't create a record if a record doesn't have to be created. And so that's his feeling. There are times when you're better off not creating that record and just picking up the telephone. Not using the blind carbon copy, making sure that if I were to send all of you an email in here, I should probably use the blind carbon copy so all of those email addresses aren't out there and accessible for phishing attacks. Being trigger happy with the reply all. I think there was a commercial out last year that said 17% of the time people mistakenly hit the reply all button when they should have just replied to the sender of that email. And it's just like, I probably shouldn't know that information. So you see that all the time in listservs where they respond to a listserv and they send the response back to the listserv as opposed to the individual. So when you start looking at email, is it an official record? Does it pertain to any kind of decision making? Does it pertain to your mission of your organization? Any kind of financial business analysis, customer service, personnel, human resources management? Are you performing any compliance with federal or state laws and regulations, responding or sending information to a regulatory agency, protecting the agency's legal interests? And so this is a decision tree. Is this official business that I'm conducting here? If that email is an official record and you're performing that as a function of your official business, then yes, it's a record. It's a record of the organization, and it has to be preserved and maintained according to the retention schedule. Non-emails, information-only copies of memoranda or attachments. Notes of a transient nature having short-term value, such as meeting notices. I got a notice about coming to this meeting today. Drafts or copies of documents. Social notices, invitations, personal messages. Emails that do not document official business. There was a lawsuit recently in Carson City where the Reno Gazette-Journal had made a public records request for emails of the governor, and what the judge decided is that of those 106 records, emails that they were requesting, only 6 of them pertained to actual business functions, and those were the official records that they turned over to the Gazette-Journal. Now, that'll probably be going into appeal, and we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about it. But I know we had, our AG's office was very excited because basically they based their decision on our policy on defining email transmitted via a records transmitted via email as a public record or not in their decision. And so it kind of, as they see it, it's one step closer to the definition of what is a public record.
They actually didn't have the other documents. They did not produce them.
Yes, the judge's office, his clerk reviewed those emails to determine if they met the definition of a public record or not. And if they met that definition, then he released them. If they were personal emails, he did not release them. Other questions? So what you want to do is make sure you have clearly defined policies and procedures, identifying what in your area would be an official record. Have a clear policy on managing the email. You want to make sure, again, that there's supported by your administration. And you can also address the appropriate and inappropriate email messages. We know that sarcasm doesn't travel well through time, and the responsibility for records as well. So much of what we send and receive is just personal communications, spam, anything of a transient nature. Some of you, depending on your level of authority too, whatever your communications will have long-term value. And so if you start setting up an archival email system, you want to make sure that you're winnowing out the garbage and keeping only those essential records and identifying why you're keeping them and for what purpose, and that will help you with your retention value to those records. Yes. At a department administration level, the director of the department will have higher value because they're at a decision-making level versus the clerical level. Well, I would advise trying to cherry pick what you do and don't keep, because it can open you up to all kinds of liability issues if you keep everything. Because there could be a lot of things in there as well that you don't. Because just the sheer volume that you have to go through, like if everybody just in this room received 100 messages a day, I mean, you look at the volume of email and the time and expense you have to go through to sort through that out in a discovery request as well. I mean, it's extremely expensive. And yeah, you have a lot of intelligence systems that can. In favor of the entity, right? Yeah, and it could support. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It could be an asset or a liability. You don't know. Right. Yeah, don't think there's just one out there. And again, you have to have a business reason to be maintaining a lot of those emails. Let's have lunch tomorrow. may not, unless it's a sexual harassment case that you're trying to follow up on too. But at some point you want to look at the time period that you're looking at too, and so maybe 7 years might be fairly excessive for your use. It's something that you have to look at what you're retaining and why you're retaining, and that could lead to what your time period is. I'm not one of those who really likes the idea of across the board keeping everything for 3 years or 7 years, etc., because there's just a lot of extraneous information in there. But if you can classify it as, yes, this has important value that I want to retain this for 6 years, this can be, destroyed after, a certain time period. No action on it will make it go away. But there's a lot to consider in all of this, and it's you're relying on the individual at that computer. That individual has to be trained enough to know, and unfortunately, we're all so busy, you don't have time to classify things as you're sending it out either. Yeah. I don't disagree with you. From a records manager's point of view, I don't see it from a technical point of view. I look at it from another perspective on at what value are you're putting a lot of money into this system, and what kind of value, what kind of return are you getting out from it? So you have to look at it from both sides. I mean, I see what Clark County is doing. I don't think they've destroyed an email in how many years? So, yeah. I think they implemented an email archiving system, I think 3 years ago, and I don't think that an email has been destroyed out of there. Number one, because the vendor is doing the storage for them, and I'm sure they're getting paid by the storage space. Mm-hmm.
End users have those data. They have to live no longer, but they didn't have to do what we want to do is we want to bring all that know back into the common central system, index, and recover what we can do over.
And see, that again, that comes back to me where I said it's the user who identifies a value to that and how long that record has to be identified. That's what they're doing with their PST files right now. And it's a litigator's nightmare, all the PST files, because you have to look in every single PST file to find, in the discovery, electronic discovery process. So, they are in favor of the archiving system. But even with that, there is still some decision that's made on how long those have to be retained, likened to the PST files. So I make a decision, is this valuable enough to be retained? I want to hang on to it because this is dealing with a quote that I'm getting for, budgeting purposes, and I know that I want to hang on to this until after the budgeting cycle ends. And if it's not approved, well, maybe I want to hang on to it another cycle in case I can submit it again. And so that's all maintained. If I maintain that all in my email, it gets moved over to my PST file, and so I have a decision on how long I want to retain it. It's not your decision, it's my decision. And so, it's not an easily resolved question.
Have a comfort, like that amendment. There's an amendment that may not follow the definition of the record, but I keep it as value
Personal email?
Yeah, I mean, it's comfort email. I keep it because,
I like the picture of the puppy on there or something like that.
the comfort emails that don't go on record, they want to keep them longer than what you go on record. Or you don't allow them to mention. You find people free.
Well, as long as they're not doing it with official records, they can delete them. There's no retention requirement for those comfort emails, as you call them. We're not dealing with official records, so if they're not the official record keeper, we don't care what they do with that record. They should be deleting them right away. Actually, they shouldn't be retaining them on government-owned devices. They shouldn't be having too much personal information on there. So, any other? We can probably discuss this afterwards. Oh, we can, yeah, and we can set up some time where we can really gnaw on this quite a bit, and so I'd be happy to sit down with you guys and on a one-on-one basis and go over all the pros and cons on this. Anybody else have issues with their dealing with their own email that they want to discuss? Okay, where were we? So what we do as records management is we look at the content of that email and determine if it meets the definition of an official record. Does this pertain to your official business? So it's a content based, not on an email. So we don't look at it from a 3-year retention of all email. We look at it on the content and the retention, the type of record it pertains to. We don't look at retaining email unless there's a reason to do so. We want to make sure that email records, that if you have official records, you look at maybe retaining it outside of the email system so that it's all the correspondence on a particular topic is kept together. It's no different than snail mail used to come into the office. You used to put a copy of that correspondence in a paper file, or you can have an electronic file of that correspondence in there as well. We want to make sure that you're following established records retention policies and procedures to determine the retention periods based on the content of that email. And that email management should be a part of every employee's regular work routine and making those decisions if they're keeping them into PST files, for example. We do have a policy in place at the state called Policy on Defining Information Transmitted via Email as a Public Record, and this is the document that the judge in the Reno Gazette Journal versus the governor relied on, and this is accessible on our website as well. I can show you. It's if you go into records management again, into electronic records, we have several policies on legal requirements for Nevada's public electronic records, lifestyle management of electronic records policy, the state of Nevada email policy, and other records that we have pertaining to electronic records in here. For non-record material, you can delete as soon as possible. We don't look at retaining that any length of time. If you're retaining records or official records, you must look at your LRDA or your retention requirements from the city and retain that record according to that retention schedule. And we do still say that it's okay to print and store it in a paper file as well if that's where the record is residing. So when we get into electronic records, specific issues that we face with electronic records, we know that the electronic format is rapidly replacing the medium of communications and transactions. Records are born digital and stay digital, and that we have to protect these records as well in documenting the citizens' rights, actions of the government officials, and the state history. So we want to make sure that the electronic record is retained in the same fashion that we would keep the old paper records, and so that we're applying the retention principles to the electronic records as well, because they are no less than the traditional forms, and basically they're becoming even more critical in the functioning of government. Different types of formats that you're going to find electronic records in. We're going to find the text messages, database formats. We know that in database formats, for example, we're not applying retention schedules in a consistent way. Last summer I was caught in hospital disclosure of information in Reno. It was with St. Mary's Hospital, where they had a database that had some personal identifying information, and it was accessible from outside the hospital. For some reason, the database was vulnerable. And so they had to identify, this is really old stale data because I had not done anything with the St. Mary's Hospital in more than 10 years. And for them to still have my personal identifying information on file, and they probably didn't have my current address, they had to hire investigators to track down all these individuals whose names and social security numbers were released on this database. So they had no method in place to automatically expunge information off of this database. So we want to make sure that records are periodically purged off a database. If the information becomes stale, you want to also apply the retention schedule to a database. And so that we're not retaining a lot of extraneous information that way too. We know we're seeing a lot of information maintaining on electronic mail, lots of discussion on that. You may have records that come over voicemail as well, and may have some documentation requirements on voicemail. There are some systems that allow, voicemail systems that allow you to save it as a WAV file, and you can save it on your system, or if you don't have those capabilities, then you'll have to have somebody transcribe the voicemail. We have records that are coming out in electronic publications formats, graphic formats. We want to make sure that we're capturing all of those records in different formats they're coming in. It's facing with all kinds of new security issues. Again, we talked about the desktop, the virtual desktop and the physical desktop, that we understand what records we're working with and what kind of security we need for those records. We have a lot of information that is in portable format. It's either in PDAs where we're getting, or Blackberries. We're getting a lot of email on our own personal devices, and if you're getting official records on your personal device, you have no control. The government has the city has no control over those records because they can leave with you because that's on your personal device. So we want to make sure that you have control over that people are not walking out of the building without some kind of protection on the personal laptops. You're just hearing horror stories all the time of laptops being stolen. I think that, Wells Fargo Mortgage, had a laptop stolen that had all the personal identifying information of mortgages. We're seeing, I think even the district attorney here had, this is in the news, that's the only way I know about it, was in the newspaper, where he had his laptop that had all the prosecution information on the OJ trial on his laptop. He set it down, was talking to somebody, turned around to walk away, forgot the laptop, turned around to get it, and somebody was already walking out the door with it. That kind of information you don't want out there. You want to make sure that you're putting some kind of protection on it. And that's what the data collector requirement, too, that's coming out in the new statute, that we require some kind of encryption on it. You want to make sure that everything is password protected, that personal devices are not being used to store official records, that people, and this is going to be really more and more difficult for us to get a handle on because of the Web 2.0, where we're dealing with people are sending records off into, as they call it, the cloud, but it's, to storage someplace else so that you can access it when you're on the road, for example, or you're sending it off to your personal email account so that you can access it later, or you're sending email on your personal email account, Yahoo or Gmail or something like that. And the city has no control over those records, and so we have a lot of loss of data going out this way too. Yeah.
Stipend or non-stipend, if you're using a personal device, do those records become discoverable even if they are a personal device?
If it's a government paid for, if you have a cell phone and the city is reimbursing you for the use of your personal device, then yes, they can be accessible for a public records request. because public funds are going to pay for that, and they can see, your bill, making sure that you are indeed conducting government business and who you've been calling on government nickel. They don't have any right to see what personal phone calls you've been making, but they have a right to see what public business you're conducting on that. Now, if you're doing I know there was an instance where an individual was contracted to come in and they were doing some conversion of a card file into a database. He brought in his own personal laptop and was doing the work on that. When he left with the data, and there was no control over that because it was his personal device. So you want to make sure that you're, putting some kind of restrictions on what kind of personal devices people can use in what types of business functions and what type of data they have access to. Make sense?
Yeah. Now, if we, like we talked about, if they make a differentiation for our own segment, we don't plan to do that, is that terrible, or is it really any government funds and all the
Yes. Yeah. And that's mostly in a public records request. And I don't know about the litigation aspect of that, but I would assume that if there was some knowledge that that those records were being stored there and it was based on public funds, that's something that you have to take to your city attorney. I'm not sure about that. I just know the public records aspect of that. And there's a Supreme Court ruling on that. If you want that, I can send it to you. Okay. Yeah. So we do have the legal requirements for Nevada Public Electronic Records. We're in the process of getting this updated. It's from 2005. It recognizes the long-term format for permanent records as being a TIFF. They're also recognizing a PDF/archive format for permanent retention of electronic records as well. And so that policy will get included in this. But basically it gives you an outline of how to maintain and store records that have the integrity and authenticity, to make sure that they're being stored in a system where no one can access or modify that record once it's been declared as a record, that it's been set aside and it's uneditable. As long as it's in draft format, then people can download it, they can check it out, they can make modifications if they have the right to do that. If it's in electronic format and it's been declared a record and the transaction has occurred and we want to document that transaction, we want to make sure that it is uneditable, that no one can get in there and modify that. It's the same concept of, when we used to walk into the airport and the baggage collector said, "Has anybody handled this bag since you packed it?" It's the same thing. We want us to have that same type of authenticity. Has anybody handled this record? Has anybody made any changes to this record since that transaction occurred? Because as you know, it's really easy to go in and modify a record and say, "Oh yeah, that's an authentic record." So you want to make sure that all those records that are stored as an official record have an audit trail and who has access to get into that record and when they were in there and what they did, the actions they did. And so that's what this particular document lays out, and how to set up a system that is basically for evidence in a litigation as well. And that record is also available on our Nevada Electronic Records webpage for the legal requirements for Nevada's public electronic records. So you want to have your retention schedule in place. You want to know what your retention is so that when you start converting those records over, scanning them into electronic format for retention, so that you know what the retention is of those records, because that really makes a difference on how those records are stored for the time period that they have to be retained. You want to make sure that you're not storing permanent records on today's equivalent of an 8-track tape, because it's not going to be around at some point. And so we want to make sure that we've identified those records that have a long-term preservation requirement. Doesn't mean it has to be permanent, but a long-term preservation. And to identify those records that have to be either migrated forward or don't have to be retained at all. I had one a student in one of my classes who was looking at her retention schedule and said, this has a 3-year retention on it. I'm scanning all of these records in, and all those records have already passed their disposition. And so what they were doing is spending a huge amount of money on a process for storing records they no longer even needed to retain because they didn't know what the retention schedule was. So it's really important when you're adapting new technology, you know what the retention of those records is, and so that you work closely with your records manager on that. If you have a long-term requirement, and in state terminology, long-term is in 10 years or more, that you build in that media migration, that you know what you migrate the software and the hardware to the next technology level. Usually within 5 years you should be okay, but anything longer than that you have to make sure that you're building in that migration. And we still look at microfilm as a good preservation tool. It's not a day-to-day business tool, but it's a good way for the essential records protection and putting it onto microfilm for preservation. And they can easily be converted back to the electronic record if something were to happen to the original record. And looking at the difference between backup and digital archiving, I know there's a lot of confusion. Am I backing it up and am I archiving it? This even was evident out of the White House in the last couple of years, where the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, has a requirement that all email communications within the White House are permanent, and they should all be digitally archived for permanent retention. Well, the White House was doing backups, and they were doing backup tapes, and they were rewriting over those backups, and so they were not retaining the records according to NARA's regulations. So they didn't know the difference between them. So backing up is for disaster recovery. So you have that snapshot of the data as it was on a certain day, that you can restore it to that day. Digital archiving is taking things in nearline or offline and storing it for retention or preservation purposes. And so again, you have to make sure that if you're doing a lot of digital archiving offline, that as you move the online data over to the new technology, that you're not leaving any orphans out there on some older technology that you may no longer have the ability to read that data on. A friend of mine was doing a records inventory for the Department of the Navy in Stockton, and they came across some huge old platters. Nothing written on them, nothing identified on them. You know, they didn't have anything to read them on. They had no idea what was on it, and do they need to retain it? So they sent it off to a facility down in Texas that has, an archive of old software and hardware. And they were able to pull the data off of it, and it was the early 60s financials. It was an accounting system from the early 60s. It could have been destroyed 30 years, 40 years ago. And so they were hanging on to it because they had no idea what was on it anymore, because it was not labeled at all, not even saying improperly labeled. And plus, it was something that was just held there and cost at a great expense to the Navy that they went through just to pull off data on it to see what was on there. So you want to make sure that if you're taking things offline and storing it digitally, that you properly identify it, and identify it with a retention schedule, identify the information such as what operating system it was written on and software, etc., to make sure that you're migrating it properly. So we do look at, we do have more and more permanent records that are coming into electronic format. We're not seeing, we don't look at CDs or DVDs or floppy disks or anything as a permanent retention. We do look at electronic records having permanent retention, though, either paper and microfilm format, and more in the electronic format using the appropriate formats. And we do have a law on the books for the reproduction of public records before destruction. So if you're scanning records in, or if you're microfilming records, you can declare that record as the official record and then destroy the paper copy, as long as there's no legal reason to hang on to the paper copy, such as a wet signature that you may need. You can declare the official record as being either the electronic or the microfilm. Now, this law was written in 1981, so it doesn't address the scanning part of it. So we're making some assumptions in there that it includes the electronic version as well. And so that's one of those laws that we need to request that they change in the next session. So in conclusion, for those of you who have not fallen asleep yet, you want to make sure that you have written policies that address your retention. And the city does have written policies that addresses retention. So you want to make sure that you know what those policies are and that you routinely follow them. You want to make sure that all of your employees are trained, that you take this information, you be the water carrier back to your individual departments and make sure that everybody knows what their retention schedule is. You want to make sure that everybody uses a retention schedule, and for their personal records that they have, that they understand the difference between an official record and a convenience copy, and that they are destroying those convenience copies on a routine basis, and that you regularly monitor for compliance to the policies. So, did you learn anything today? Now, I don't know. I do have some of your policies online. Did you want me to bring up your retention schedule? I can see if I can't get to it. So you can see what that looks like and how to read your retention schedule. Excuse me while I go behind the curtain.
Connecting to Gatekeeper, can we not get onto our CityNet?
Well, I do have.
Who's logged in here, you know?
I thought it was Peter. Where's that little? It's actually the AMS that we had.
It's AMS in here?
You have to change it. Can you get to it?
Oh, guys,
No, cancel that.
Do a right mouse click and go to Explore. Is that your?
I was trying to right mouse click.
There's no, right there.
Where's it at?
She thinks she has a copy on.
I think I do have it on the thumb drive.
So you wanna.
Which one? I've got the life cycle.
You want
This one?
top of the, that's our retention schedule.
That's what you said. Is there, well, just to identify how to read it. Is there any specific one that you want me to look at?
You can even scroll down the whole system. I think it goes on.
Cool.
Okay, here's your retention schedule for the city. So it gives you a topic number. It gives you the LRDA, the Local Government Records Disposition Authorization that applies to. So if it's found in our general schedule that we publish for local governments, then she's used that as a reference number, and so that is an approved retention schedule by the state. Gives you the description, what type of information is found in that record. And so she has a fairly thorough definition of what that particular record is. She gives you the minimum retention period, erase after the retention period required for equivalent hard copy. Save as equivalent hard copy. Same as equivalent hard copy. So in other words, what she's saying in this is that it's content driven. So you have to know what the retention schedule is for the content of the record. Let's back up here and look at another one. I wonder how far away I can run this little guy. So here's your correspondence. It gives you the description. Purge annually of unneeded material. So they're saying that probably at the end of every calendar year you should be looking at this and determine if it has any value. And then is recommended this type of correspondence retained no longer than 3 calendar years. So it does have a minimum retention period in there. Department regulations and policies. Now, this is 6 calendar years after superseded or abandoned officially. So this has a retention period of supersession or abandonment, and it gives you the citation, a description of the record. So you want to pay attention to the retention requirement and the description of the record, and it should give you the event that has to occur for that retention period. Here's correspondence, for example, administrative correspondence. And so this has a permanent retention where there general correspondence and general inquiries is a routine response. This is for the administrative procedures and achievements. The series includes electronic mail, the communications above. This is a permanent retention and with an LRDA number attached to it. So is there any kind of specific record that you're interested in looking at? Have you all seen the retention record? Has anybody not seen it? That's good. That's good. It's getting around. So this is something that you have to routinely look at to make sure that it is meeting your needs of your operation. That if you ever have any questions on your retention, that you should bring it in front of the records management folks and ask them for a review of that schedule. And they will go over the requirements for that particular record and do the analysis required. Anything else?
No, we do have up on City Clerk's website all the retention schedules for the entire city. So feel free to look. If you call the department directory, City Clerk, over on the right-hand side, one of those hot links says retention schedule. If you click on that, you'll see all the departments are laid out and then all the different specific schedules. General or approved? Yes. And you can start destruction. On that same menu on the right, there's a link that says policies and procedures. If you click on that, that's got our new destruction certification form that we created at the records committee in December. That's the form you need to use. And on that same page, there's a records operating procedure that tells you how to use that form. And then, of course, you're welcome to call any of us in the division if you have questions. But now that we have adopted retention schedules, we can start purging.
Use your retention schedules. It gives you that authority to destroy those records. As long as you know that there is no audit requirement or litigation or any kind of investigation going on, those records, as long as the minimum retention has been met, you can start your disposition cycles. And so they have what they have is a destruction notification. You notify you of your destruction prior to destruction of the records. Okay, and so you give them, you fill out the form that says we're going to destroy these records, and they sign off on that and give you the authority to destroy those records. So this is a good thing. Make sure that you implement it, but you also want to make sure, again, that you're not cherry-picking records, that you're not conveniently forgetting some records, that you are systematic and routine in the destruction of your records. Because if you're doing records of destruction this year, but you don't do it again for another 3 years, they're going to wonder what you were trying to hide in 2009 to destroy those records. Because you want that systematic destruction of those records, and that's what they look at, and making sure that you are fully following the retention schedule. Yes? Yeah. If there's some reason why you're not following it and because of something happens, it's always a good idea to document the fact that you're not following it so that you have a record of why you're not following it, so that if there's any question, you can say, well, I have documentation of why this wasn't followed, but I got caught up at this date, for example. So that's a good thing, to have that explanation at the time that it's happening. You don't want to have to go back and recreate that record, because they, always question the fact that, was that true and accurate record of what the events that happened. And so they want to make sure that if you record it at the time it's happening, they'll understand that. So, okay, thank you all for coming today. Have a great afternoon. Let you out a little bit early. I'll be around for a while for answering any questions. So, thanks, Luann.